phallus flower, and we have had quite a lot happen in the last 24 hours. Since our last update, I want to try and step you through all the various things that we've had going on. And there's a bit of activity happening behind me. We've got some team members working on samples behind us over here. So like almost like a lab set up inside our glass house has occurred. But when we left you last night, we had a lot of activity around the flower heating up. This morning when our staff arrived back here at the flower bloom in the glass house at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney, the spadix, the structure at the top, had collapsed, and pretty much like Patricia had done a few weeks ago. But if I give you a visual update, I'm going to have to then walk you back in time on what's happened. So if I come down here, this is all we're left with right now. We've removed the top of the spadix, which is currently being sampled. We have removed the skirt, the petal-like structure called the spathe, to gain access to the pollen, which is down here. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. And in the last half hour or so, the pollen has started to mature and ooze out, which is what we've been waiting for. So let me walk you through some various parts of the flower. We've got over here Mika and Rosemary, who are from the University of Technology, Sydney, who are currently sampling parts of the spadix, the spike-like structure on top. It was the organ that was responsible for producing the odour. So we've had Bridget sampling it for looking at odour compounds related to the corpse flower name, the death scent, and the odour compounds that come with it. And Mika and Rosemary are here now sampling parts of the spadix, which is the organ responsible for producing these compounds and heating up. And they're, as you can see, chopping out, they've unfurled and chopping out little panels to go and do analytical chemistry on to see what compounds they can find within that structure. Possibly relate to Bridget's work and possibly not. Could we just hassle you for a minute while you're beavering away there, and one of you maybe explain what it is you'll probably do with these samples?
So we do spatial mass spectrometry, which is looking at the spatial distribution, like little images of, in our case, we're doing elements like copper, zinc, magnesium, and then we'll also be looking at possibly proteins, lipids, and other sugars, and just to map them and see how it may develop as it goes down the spadix in relation to histo.
Excellent. So you'll see the sampling that they've got down the length. So there may or may not be differences along the height or the length of the spadix, and in addition to finding out what compounds are there, we'll be able to see spatially across that whether there's any difference from bottom to top. What we observed last night was as the spadix was heating up, we could distinctly see the heat down the bottom, and there was a second hotspot right at the top peak of the spadix, which is probably a chimney effect of the heat rising. And if I show you, I'm going to try and show you what it looks like inside the structure down here. And you can see it's quite fibrousy. It's like a spider web inside, a bit like a loofah if you've ever seen one of those. And so it's essentially hollow, and that explains why it collapses as the flower heats up and eventually burns out all its energy and collapses. By the time I came in today, the spadix was cold. So the ambient temperature in this glasshouse was up to about 33, and the spadix was about 24, so significantly cooler than the ambient. It was clearly a cold structure by this morning. So the next bit that we've been working on is really down here in the floral biology hub of the flower. But just to remind you, these structures at the bottom here, the dark reddy brown, are the female flowers. And in Patricia, we hand pollinated those in the hope that they would set berries. These little stigmatic surfaces here are sticky to the touch when they're receptive, and they've lost their stickiness now because it's not all about them, it's about the male flowers, which are just above here. And over the last couple of hours, I've watched the temperature spike up to about 34 degrees here, and it's been slowly cooling down over the last couple of hours, which shows that the male flower structures have matured And I'm not sure if you can see, but right down at this junction here between the female flowers and the male flowers, the pollen is literally starting to ooze out like pimples. It's squeezing out like a long strand of cheese. So I'm going to introduce you now to Dr. Nathan Emery, who is the manager of the seed bank of the Australian Plant Bank at Mount Annan. And Nathan's got his little lab set up down here. G'day, Nathan. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Hope you're all doing well out there.
Thanks, Nathan. We appreciate you coming in to work on the pollen tonight. So what have you been doing over the last hour or so as the pollen's been maturing?
Yeah, so I've been collecting some of the first signs of pollen being oozed out of the male flowers. So I've got a little bit here. You may see a little bit of yellow powder on the aluminium foil. So that's the first pollen grains that have been expelled from the flower. And what I'm doing, sampling this pollen over potentially several hours over the time that it's been produced by the flowers, and putting it into these Petri plates, which I have to keep nice and level because there is a drop of mineral solution that's mixed with sugar. So in this mineral solution, we have things like boric acid, potassium, calcium, and these are compounds that the stigma produces and that the pollen grains, when they attach to the stigma when it's receptive, will stimulate those pollen grains to germinate. And what that looks like is a little tube comes out of the pollen if it's viable, and it will head down the stigmatic tube and fertilize the ovary. So we're trying to replicate that in an artificial environment, and to really get an idea of what the viability of that pollen is. And we're doing this over the period of time that the pollen's been presented, so we can track viability of that pollen over several hours. Perhaps pollen is at its highest viability later on in the evening during the male phase, or perhaps it peaks really early on and then drops out. And that will be really important information for us to make sure that with future blooms that we can extract pollen and store it at its most viable.
So Nathan had worked on Putricia's pollen. One of the things that I did was race that pollen back following her male pollen oozing 2.5 weeks ago to the Australian Plant Bank. And Nathan has been working on Putricia's pollen. Nathan, could you give us an update just on what you observed from working on that pollen that we sent back there?
Yeah, so what we found, and we put that pollen into 2 different storage environments, both at a cool temperature at around about 4 degrees and then a cold temperature at minus 20 degrees. We found that the pollen viability was very, very low, surprisingly low. And while that came as a bit of a shock, with a bit of investigative search through the literature, pollen, the viability of pollen of this species and indeed the family itself is quite low and declines very, very rapidly. So we're really working against the clock in order to try and understand more about this pollen viability and how rapidly we need to get this pollen into storage so that we maintain its viability for as long as possible.
So I'm not going to keep Nathan from delaying his process, because we want to make sure that we get this pollen collected as quickly as possible. But am I right that with Patricia, we think there was about a 5% viability of the pollen? That
around about a 5% viability. So very, very low. But bear in mind too that there are thousands, millions of pollen grains that are produced over this period of time. So 5% on the surface may seem quite low, but that still could be millions of pollen grains, that 5% that are viable.
Fantastic, Nathan. Thanks for sharing some of the science that's going on behind the scenes, and I hope you can see why it's so critical that we've dissected this poor flower up into multiple parts to learn as much as we possibly can. I'm going to leave Nathan to get on with harvesting some pollen. We might have a chat in the next few minutes of any questions that you might be dying to ask me or Nathan or one of the other team members that are here at the moment. And then hopefully we'll get a glimpse of Nathan going back and harvesting a bit more pollen before the evening is over. So throw some questions to us. I'll check in with Ella over here and see if there's something that one of you is dying to ask us.
Yeah, so we've just noticed someone, it's not so much a question, but I'm going to pose it to you as one.
All right, bring it on.
They want to have a corpse flower as a house plant.
Haha.
What are your thoughts?
Okay, the question is, someone would like to have a corpse flower, a Titan arum as a house plant. What are my thoughts? We've actually had a couple of people come up to me with Patricia saying they already have them growing as a house plant. Are they hard to grow? What do they have to do to get them to flower? They're actually a really easy plant to grow. If you can get one from a legitimate source that has been ethically acquired, I would encourage you to grow them as a house plant. They probably won't flower unless you have the capacity for recreating an environment like ours is in. Here's one of our glass houses you can see. If you were watching the live stream yesterday, we have about 13 plants currently in our collection. Here's some of the younger ones here in the front, and I'll bring you over a little bit further to see our largest one. I bashed my head on that rail yesterday. This is our largest one in the moment in the collection. It actually has 2 stems and is capable of producing 2 flowers at any given time. Sometimes they can produce up to 3, a triplet. So they're easy to grow, but they're not easy to flower. We keep ours in somewhere between 25 to 28 degrees most of the year. It was 33 in here today, and they need high humidity. So that's a bit tricky in a domestic environment to recreate.
We've got people who potentially weren't on earlier who would love to see inside the space again. I'm going to delve back in.
You should have been here at the start, everybody, if you wanted to see it. No, let's go back in and have another closer look down here. I'm just going to move some trip hazards out of my way. So back down here to where the spadix was. So this is the big spike. This pit was hidden behind the petal structure, which we've now cut away, that you can see down here. And hopefully you can see how loofah-like and spongy it is. So we've got this thin shell of sorts. It's actually, you can see me flexing it there. And then this fibrous tissue inside that's sort of like a structural web that provides nutrition and moisture to the spadix as it's developing rapidly.
So, 2 questions to go through. Someone was just asked, is this Patricia? So maybe it's time to show them.
Oh, all right. No, this is not Patricia, but this is a clone of Patricia. And if you didn't catch us yesterday, we were talking about it's possible to make a leaf cutting. So Titan arums grow from seeds. Once the seed grows into a leaf structure, like the ones behind me here, it's possible to make a petiole cutting and strike roots off it, just like a normal cutting. And that cutting will eventually produce another leaf and a corm and roots. And we have 4 clones within our collection. Patricia flowered 2.5 weeks ago. This one is number 2. Number 3 looks currently like this pot just here. Not sure whether that's going to be a leaf or a flower just yet. And the 4th of our clones is this one just here, which is just about to go dormant. And when it goes dormant, it'll look pretty sad, like this brown mushy goo that's below me here. So they go through this phase of cycles of leaf for 5, 7, 10 years before they'll produce a flower. They need to get the corm large enough to have sufficient energy to push out a flower, and that's when Patricia had a 15-kilo corm, enough size to be able to push up her bulb into that big 1.63 metre high spike. For those of you who missed it, this is an update on Patricia just here. Not much to speak of. You can see that it appears that we've had some failed pollination on this side and through the centre section here. It looks like we've had some successful pollination on this side, but as you can see down here, this peduncle, the watermelon-like structure that you can see here, watermelon skin colour, it has started to die off on one side, and typically that's not a good sign that the seeds are going to continue through to maturity. But we'll keep a watch and care for her as best we can. If she fails producing seeds, she's going to come back as a new leaf, and in the next 5 to 7 years she should flower again at some point.
Cool. We've got a question asking if we've ever worked with Indonesian botanical gardens for pollen exchange.
So our question, I'll repeat it, is have we ever worked with any of the Indonesian facilities, conservation agencies on Titan arum genetics? We haven't directly. We tend to focus on our partnerships being with other botanic gardens around the globe and exchanging genetic material. We have actively been participating in the Australian exchange, and the plants that we've got here, these 4 plants in particular that I mentioned, have come from the South Australian Botanic Gardens, Mount Lofty Botanic Garden, Botanic Gardens and State Herbarium in South Australia. And we're very thankful to the team, Matt Coulter and his team down there, who have been not just generous with their plant material they've given us, but the massive amount of intellectual knowledge that they'd share across to all our team members here in helping to cultivate these plants and taking us through the pollination process, particularly with Patricia and ongoing support. We're really thankful, and from the bottom of our heart, I really thank him so much.
People are asking, why is it called a leaf even though it looks like a tree?
Ooh. Yes, it does look like a tree, but it's a matter of botanical nomenclature. These are leaf-like structures called petioles. So a petiole is actually the stem-like structure often that supports a leaf. In the same way that at the very bottom down here, this base below the flower is called a peduncle. Working in a botanic garden, we have lots of funky names that we have to remember, and it's just a matter of categorization and our taxonomic classification of plant parts.
I'm just going to pounce on these guys and say they look like they're wrapped up, so maybe we can ask them some more questions.
All right. So we now have, back to Micah and Rosemary down here, they have butchered holes into this bloom. It almost looks like they're making a Halloween mask now. I'm not really sure. Or maybe it's that thing out of Castaway with the hand stamp. I don't know, something going on. So you've collected all your samples now. What happens now when you go back to the laboratory?
So half of them go into deep freeze, and then half of them start the process of getting ready to be sliced up and analyzed, and some of them will be stained with different dyes, so you can look at different structures. Some of them will be treated in certain ways so that when you do analysis of them, you look at very specific things like the fats in there, or the sugars in there, or the elements in there, just to make sure that you only analyze a specific thing. You don't get confused by other signals that could be in the plant life.
So is it something that you would expect to see on a screen with a line that shows peaks and troughs for the different compounds, or is that a totally different process?
So it's the same with us, but the peaks and troughs are all within a single pixel, and you get a nice image. So you'll be able to see.
You get them spatially.
So
Ooh,
you'll see,
cool.
With the dyes, where we're gonna just look at them with microscopes, we're gonna try and correlate the substructure there with little bits of metal or little bits of sugar or whatever we can find.
Brilliant.
I'm going to interrupt and say Nathan's doing something
Oh,
very exciting
excuse me.
down there.
All right, so we're back to Nathan. Let's find out what Nathan's up to down here. So I'll try and allow him to multitask. But so Nathan is now coming back in to sample the next wave of pollen, and it's really starting. I'll see how close I can get in without distracting Nathan. It's starting to ooze like little strands off the flower, and the pollen is distinctly darker than the little capsules that it's coming from.
Yeah, so very technically using effectively a small spoon to start at the bottom and just lightly scrape the pollen all the way up. So you can kind of see it there stuck to the edge of the spoon. And I'm just doing that a few times around the plant. And even where there may not be a lot of pollen, but just to get a nice representative sample. And then I'm just scraping that pollen onto my little aluminium foil book cover. And then we'll keep doing that as the pollen keeps coming and continue to sample it, test its viability.
So Nathan's breaking it down into time segments just so that we can see whether there's any difference over time in the quality of the pollen. It may be that the early release pollen has a higher degree of viability than the late release pollen, or it might be the other way around, or there might be no difference, but the only way we're going to find out is to do that analysis. And as soon as Nathan is finished here tonight, we expect the pollen to keep oozing probably for the next hour or two, based on Patricia's events, and he will then race that material back to the laboratory to keep it cool and continue to do analysis over the coming weeks and months on the viability. Hopefully we can extend the life of this pollen by not just months, but hopefully years, which gives us the best chance of being able to exchange it across botanic institutions, because the flowers are fairly irregular. I noticed a question earlier, do we know there's one flowering in Canberra at the moment? Absolutely, we hope it's going well and people aren't waiting hours and hours to see that bloom down there. We're send our congratulations to the Australian National Botanic Garden in Canberra and hope their bloom is doing particularly well.
All right, we've had a few questions come on in.
Yep,
So
fire
a
up.
few around insect pollination. Is it possible for it to have been naturally fertilised due to the insect activity? And on the same note, what kind of bugs and insects are attracted to this flower?
Sure. All right, so let's talk about insect pollination. First and foremost, we are not in a rainforest in Sumatra in Indonesia. So we don't have the natural insects that occur over in those rainforests, which would normally be carrion beetles and flies that are local to the rainforest. However, unlike Patricia, we saw a huge number of blowflies come in last night to this bloom. And if you haven't caught up on our live stream from last night, those blowflies came in, they did lots of buzzing around for a while, and then as dusk came and the sun disappeared, the blowflies started to lay their eggs inside the flower, and some of them are still visible. I'm going to come around here beside Nathan and hopefully point them out. So they laid their eggs just on the junction over there and over here, little white structures just between the spadex and the start of the pollen. I can't tell you why they did that. The species of blowflies that we have would not be familiar with the Titan arum. We do not have it growing in Australia, so that was just really interesting to us watching that happen. Some of the flies copulated in there. They disappeared by this morning, so they've obviously gone off. And tonight, normally, there would be flies attracted into this flower to pick up some of the pollen and move it to another flower if it was flowering in the wild situation, which obviously we don't have endless number of blooms flowering.
We've got two questions for Nathan, if he's got a minute to spare.
Yep.
Which is, how long does it take for that root-like structure to appear from the pollen grains in the mineral solution?
Great question. So how long do those pollen tubes start to appear? We actually saw the very first pollen tubes from pollen we collected from Patricia emerge within the first 6 hours. So it's actually very, very quick, but that's not unusual. Most species, their pollen will germinate within the first 24 to 48 hours. So, but it's nice that it's very quick, makes it easy to check.
All right, and I've got a question for you, Nathan. You're using a little plastic spoon there, and last time you used a dessert spoon. Which one is holding up better?
Well, this one's working a charm, so I'm going to say plastic fantastic. Making sure that we clean it between samples as well, regardless of whether it's made from plastic or metal. But this one's a little bit smaller. It's not as big as a dessert spoon, so it does take more scoops to be able to get enough pollen from the plant, but just as effective.
I've got to say, just watching Nathan work this time is a real pleasure, because we really struggled with trying to collect pollen with a complete spathe wrapped around the flower, and so we ended up choosing a dessert spoon last time, just simply to be able to get in and cover as much surface area as possible. In removing the spathe that's sort of, I guess, enveloping this structure, it's given Nathan the ability to move right around the flower and give full access to each side and give us visuals as well. So we're keeping an eye on the temperature as it's cooling down. The flower's now in a closed down phase. This is its last function it has to provide, is to ooze out this pollen. and Nathan will continue to work both around 360 degrees around the flower and from bottom to top to sample that pollen over the next few hours.
Okay, alright. It seems like the questions have slowed down a bit and we're about half an hour, so can we wrap up with some updates for social media?
Alrighty, so this will be the last live stream that we're going to do on this bloom, and crossing our fingers that we'll have more blooms in the near future to share with you. We are very excited to be able to give you continuing updates through social media on the family of our Titan arums, the science work that we're doing, and with our partners at UTS and Bridget's work with her PhD. As Nathan processes the pollen and gets updates on the quality of it, we'll continue to share that information with you. Please ask questions. We'll endeavour to incorporate them into other FAQs. This is going to be the last time you see my floral shirts for a while, which is great for you as well, because I need to go and do some washing. I smell a little bit like the stinky flowers, and I really appreciate, as I said last time with Patricia, the curiosity, the candor, the questioning, the engagement, and the support from all of our plant-minded community out there. Thank you for loving the work that we do, and it's been such a pleasure to be able to share these updates with you. I can't do anything but thank, in particular, this lady who's going to hide behind the camera. This is Ella, who does really all the hard work in keeping you all informed. I just stand in front of the camera and she chucks questions at me. So I want to thank Ella in particular for the work, and we really look forward to sharing more exciting plant conservation stories. If you want to support us, we would love to have you come on as a member of the Foundation Friends of the Botanic Gardens, or provide a donation in the future that can help continue the work that we do. And on behalf of all of my team, my colleagues in both our science team and our horticulture team, thank you so much for watching.